Ghost Highway. Prologue. The static hum. There are roads that connect cities. There are roads that lead to the sea. And then there are roads that lead to nowhere. They slice through the emptiness like scars on the face of the earth. And they are traveled only by those with nowhere else to go. Truckers, runaways, and nocturnal ghosts. In the heart of the Nevada desert, there is just such a road. A stretch of Highway 95 that the locals call the Static Mile. Officially, it doesn't exist. On maps, it's just a straight line. But those who drive it often enough know the truth. They know that on this stretch of road, the world grows thin. The legends of truckers told over the counters of roadside diners under the buzz of neon signs speak of many things, of radios that start picking up voices from the past, children's rhymes, deathbed prayers, the furious arguments of long-dead lovers, of phantom lights in the rear-view mirror that follow you for mile after mile, only to vanish, of figures on the roadside that seem real until you get closer. But the most terrifying legend is about the stuck ones. Those who experience such a powerful shock on this road that their emotions, their despair, their grief were imprinted onto the asphalt, and now the road plays them back over and over like a scratched record. The eternal crash at mile marker 112, the perpetually weeping bride at the dangerous curve sign. Most people dismiss it. Fatigue, the heat, a trick of the imagination. But they're wrong. The road is not just asphalt and gravel. It is an entity. It listens, it remembers, and it is always hungry for new stories. Chapter 1. The Podcaster. Jake Rivers considered himself a collector of America's scars. At least, that's how he introduced himself in the intro to his podcast, American Underbelly. In reality, Jake was a collector of unpaid bills, empty whiskey bottles, and eviction notices. His podcast, once his passion, had devolved into a desperate attempt to stay afloat. He explored urban legends, conspiracy theories, unsolved cases, anything that might bring him a few more listens. But the audience was fickle. They demanded something new, something real, something that would make their blood run cold. He stumbled upon the Static Mile by accident. At 3 a.m., having fallen down a rabbit hole of internet forums for long-haul truckers. The thread was titled, The Curse 95. Hundreds of messages, dozens of stories, each more terrifying than the last. Most were obvious fabrications, but some were written with such desperate sincerity that Jake felt a prick of cold professional interest. One post from a user named Old Pete hooked him. Thoughtful. It's not evil. It's just lonely. It takes what it needs, strong feelings. If you drive it with anger in your heart, it will show you anger. If with grief, it will drown you in grief. Sad. I was driving it the night I got the call that my wife had died. Now I sometimes hear her voice in the radio static, calling me home. I never drive that stretch anymore. I'm afraid that one day I'll stop and stay with her. This was it. The story. Not just a legend, but a tragedy, something real, something that could save his podcast. And maybe himself. The obsession took hold. He spent a week gathering all the information he could, mapping out the reports, marking the exact mile markers where ghosts had been seen. He read old newspaper clippings about the construction of this stretch of highway in the 70s, about the delays, about strange findings that were quickly covered up. He bought a new digital recorder, a couple of action cams, and a case of energy drinks with his last few dollars. He didn't just want to tell this story, he wanted to record it. Chapter 2: The Road to Nowhere. The drive to Nevada was long. Jake drove his old pickup, as rusted and beaten as his life. The farther he got from the lights of Los Angeles, the more the landscape changed. The urban sprawl gave way to endless fields, and then to the sun-scorched desert. The horizon shimmered in the heat haze, and the sky was so vast and empty it felt like it could crush him. He made one last stop in a small town called Tonopah, the last bastion of civilization before the long road to nowhere. He went into a roadside diner that smelled of old coffee and bacon. An old man in a faded baseball cap sat at the counter. "Coffee?" asked the waitress, a woman with tired eyes. "Yes, please. And tell me, am I heading the right way for north on the 95? The man at the counter turned to him. "Where are you headed, son?" "Just driving," Jake lied, "seeing the country." The old man grunted. "See that you don't linger on one stretch. About 50 miles from here. Locals call it the static mile. If your radio starts hissing, just turn it off and keep driving. Don't stop, no matter what you see." "And what might I see?" Jake asked, trying to hide his interest. "Nothing good," the old man snapped, turning back to his coffee. "Nothing you'd want to remember." This conversation only spurred him on. He drove into the sunset, which painted the desert in shades of blood orange and purple. He set up the cameras on his dashboard and windshield. He turned on the recorder. He was ready. The "Welcome to Highway 95" sign was riddled with bullet holes. Jake passed it and felt the air change. It became still, quiet. Even the rumble of his old engine seemed to grow muffled. He had entered the static mile. Chapter 3: First Contact. For the first 20 miles, nothing happened. Just the endless, straight black ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The desert on either side was lifeless. Jake was beginning to think it was all just a tall tale, a way for locals to have fun with outsiders. And then his radio came to life. It was off, but a quiet crackle of static suddenly erupted from the speakers. Then, through the hiss, a voice emerged. A woman's. She was humming a lullaby, an old, forgotten melody that sent a chill down Jake's spine. The voice was clear, but it seemed to come from far away, from another time. It lasted for about 10 seconds, then cut off. Jake grabbed his recorder. "Did you hear that?" He whispered into the microphone. The radio turned on by itself. It was a lullaby. He felt the first prick of real animal fear. There was more. In his peripheral vision, he caught movement on the roadside. He snapped his head to the side. Nothing. Just a cactus shaped like a crooked human figure. A trick of the light. But he was sure he had seen something. He heard a sound, the phantom honk of a truck right behind him. He instinctively ducked his head and glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was completely empty. It was subtle, elusive. The road seemed to be probing him, testing his reactions. It was like a predator playing with its prey before striking. Jake gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He was scared, but a part of him, the journalist part, was exulting. This was real. Chapter 4: Voices in the Static. The road began to recognize him. It no longer broadcast random echoes of the past. It began to dig into his own head. The radio turned on again. This time it was a song, the very song that had played at his prom when he danced with his ex-girlfriend Emily, a memory he had tried to bury for years. The pain of it was as sharp as it had been a decade ago. Then, his father's voice came from the speakers, a recording of their last, most terrible argument. "You're a disappointment, Jake. You had talent, and you traded it for these stupid ghost stories of yours." Every word was a blow. The road had found his sore spots, and now it was pressing on them with all its might. He tried to turn off the radio, but it didn't respond. He tried to turn up the volume of the podcast he was listening to, as a distraction, but these voices cut through it. His own fears, his deepest regrets, voiced by the phantoms of the airwaves. "You're alone, Jake. Emily never loved you. You're going to die out here, and no one will even notice." It was psychological warfare, perfectly calibrated. He screamed. He pounded the dashboard, but it didn't help. He was trapped in a car with his worst demons, and the road itself was their amplifier. Chapter 5. The Stuck Ones. He saw her from a distance, a white spot on the roadside against the darkening desert. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman in a wedding dress. It was torn and dirty. She was on her knees, sobbing, her whole body shaking. His first impulse was to stop, to help, but the old man's words in the diner echoed in his head. "Don't stop, no matter what you see." He drove past. When he looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone. He grabbed the recorder. "I saw her, the bride, the one they wrote about on the forum. Her fiancé left her on the way to their Vegas wedding, and she just got out of the car and stayed here." He drove for a few more miles, his heart pounding like a drum. Ahead, he saw flashing lights, police cars, an ambulance, a wrecked car overturned on its roof. He slowed down, but as he approached the crash scene, he saw that the cars were old, from the 70s, and they were semi-transparent. He could see the desert through the mangled metal. He saw phantom paramedics trying to pull a phantom body from the car. The scene replayed itself over and over like a looping GIF, a moment of death, imprinted on time. He floored it. The legends were true, all of them, and he was driving right into their heart. Chapter 6. The Motel Investigation.
Jay pulled off Highway 95 at the first exit he saw, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. He found refuge in an old rundown motel called the Stardust. The room smelled of dust and desperation. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and collapsed onto the bed. For a few hours he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what he had seen. Then the journalist in him woke up. He couldn't just run away, he had to understand. He spent the next 2 days in his room, turning it into a makeshift investigation headquarters. He listened to his audio recordings, reviewed the footage from his cameras. The voices were there, the ghostly lullaby, the snippets of his argument with his father. But there was nothing on the video, no woman in a wedding dress, no crash. The cameras hadn't seen them. It was something perceived directly by the mind. He started digging deeper into the history of this stretch of road. He spent hours online, poring over archives of local newspapers. He found a few short articles. Construction on northern section of Highway 95 temporarily halted due to unexpected geological findings. The next article, a month later, work resumed. Contractor, Western Paving Co. assures the project will be completed on schedule.
He found information on Western Paving Co. The company had gone bankrupt a year after the project was finished. No details. Then he found what he was looking for. An obituary. A former foreman for Western Paving Co., a man named Frank Kowalski, had died 2 years ago, but the obituary mentioned his brother, who still lived in Tonopah. Jake found the number. He stared at it for a long time before dialing. Chapter 7. The Source. Frank's brother, George Kowalski, was an old man with hands like old leather gloves and eyes that had seen too much. He lived in a small trailer on the outskirts of Tonopah. At first, he didn't want to talk, but when Jake mentioned the static mile, the old man and poured him a glass of cheap whiskey. Frank called it the Road of Bones, George began, his voice. It haunted him till the day he died. He told the story. When they started laying the road, the excavators hit something. An ancient burial ground, Native American, probably Paiute. Bones, pottery shards, strange amulets made of stone and bone. By law, they should have stopped work and called in archaeologists, but that would have meant delays, fines. The company was already on the verge of bankruptcy. The site supervisor, a guy named Henderson, was a real son of a bitch. George continued. He said, "We don't have time for this crap." He ordered the workers to gather all those bones and artifacts, throw them into the industrial rock crusher, and use them as part of the aggregate for the asphalt. Jake felt his stomach clench. They literally paved over an Indian burial ground. Frank said that even after, at night, the workers would hear strange sounds coming from the freshly laid asphalt. Whispers, crying. He said the road was alive, and it was angry because it had been disturbed. Now Jake knew these weren't just artifacts. They were shamanic tools, resonators, perhaps designed for communicating with spirits. And now the road itself had become a giant resonator, saturated with death, pain, and desecrated magic. Chapter 8. The Second Dive. Armed with this knowledge, Jake decided to go back. He was scared to death, but he had to get proof. He had to record the whole story. He waited for nightfall. This time, he didn't just drive. He stopped right in the middle of the static mile. He turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. And the road answered. This time, it wasn't just sounds. It was full, detailed hallucinations. The road no longer reflected his fears. It built worlds out of them. He saw Emily. She was standing on the roadside, as beautiful as the day they met. "Why did you let me go, Jake?" she asked, her voice full of real, heart-wrenching sorrow. He knew it was an illusion, but the pain was real. He saw his father standing in the middle of the road, shaking his head. "I always knew you were a failure." The desert around him transformed into the ruins of his life. He saw his old office at the newspaper, his first failure, every mistake, every wrong turn. The road had opened up his soul and turned it inside out, showing him its ugliest parts. He sat in his car, catatonic with terror, as the ghosts of his past danced on the hood of his pickup. Chapter 9. The Loop. When he finally managed to compose himself, he started the engine and hit the gas. He had to get out of there. He drove for an hour, 2. He should have been long past the static mile by now, but the landscape didn't change. The same cactus shaped like a crooked figure, the same lone bullet-riddled sign. He looked at the odometer. He had driven 100 miles, but he hadn't moved. He was in a loop. Panic began to give way to a cold, all-consuming despair. He pulled over and looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was almost on empty. The sun wasn't rising. The eternal starless night of the desert. He was trapped. The road was playing with him, draining him of his last vestiges of hope. Chapter 10. The Realization. He sat in the silence, listening only to the beating of his own heart. And then he understood. The road wasn't just evil, it was hungry. It fed on emotion, his fear, his panic, his despair. This was a feast for it. The more he feared, the stronger the loop became. He couldn't beat it with force. He had to stop feeding it. He had to change his emotional state. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He forced himself to breathe, slowly, deeply. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He stopped thinking about the ghosts and the loop. He started thinking about something else, something simple. He remembered the taste of his first morning coffee, the feeling of the warm sun on his face, the sound of his sister's laugh. He clung to these small, simple, real moments like a drowning man to a life raft. He filled himself not with fear, but with calm, with acceptance. Chapter 11. The last podcast. He knew what he had to do. To break free, he had to give the road something, a new, strong emotion, something it hadn't tasted yet. He took his recorder. He got out of the car and stood in the middle of the completely silent highway. He pressed record. "This is Jake Rivers," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "And this is the final episode of American Underbelly." He didn't talk about the ghosts or the Indian burial ground. He started talking about himself. He confessed to everything. To the lie that had cost him his career, to his pride, to his fear of being a nobody. He talked about his envy of successful people, his inability to maintain relationships, his loneliness. But there was no fear or despair in his voice. There was acceptance. He wasn't making excuses, he was just stating facts. He was accepting himself for who he was, a failure, a liar, a lonely man in the middle of a cursed road in the desert. He spoke for about an hour. He poured all his pain, all his truth into the microphone, offering it to the road not as a victim, but as a gift. "This is me," he said at the end. "This is my whole story. You can have it." When he finished, the silence was different. It was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. Chapter 12. The dawn. He got back in the car. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, but it started. He looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was at half a tank. He drove. 5 minutes later, he saw lights ahead. A gas station. A motel. He had broken out of the loop. The dawn was breaking on the horizon, painting the sky in soft pastel colors. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. He was free, but he had paid a price. The emotions he had poured into his recorder, his ambition, his shame, his deep despair, they were gone. He remembered the events, but he didn't feel their weight. He was hollowed out. The road had accepted his gift and left him with an emptiness. Epilogue. Silence on the airwaves. The final episode of American Underbelly became a sensation. It blew up the internet, millions of listens, offers from major networks. Jake Rivers was finally a success, but he didn't care. He never recorded another podcast. He left the city and settled in a small cabin in the mountains. He took long walks. He read books. He enjoyed the silence. Sometimes when he was driving on a normal, ordinary road, his radio would fill with static for a second. And in that white noise, he would imagine he heard a quiet, distant, the voice of the road. It remembered him. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, he thought it was still calling to him, but he would just turn off the radio and keep driving. He had already told it his story, and he had nothing left to offer.
Thanks for watching to the end. We've got plenty more exciting videos coming your way, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out.